Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. It's another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Kathryn Grayson Nanz. She's a senior developer advocate at Progress. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I am very well. It is snowing over here at the Hanselman podcast studio, which caused a little bit of internet trouble before, but I am living the dream now. So, listen, you're working on your Master's of Science in Human-Computer Interaction. You're going to get that probably, later this year? Is that right?
Probably next year, but yes.
Next year, you think? So you're in the thick of it. But I'm curious, as someone who's got a foot in tech, but also a BFA, a fine arts degree, and now you're bridging it into a human-computer interaction degree, do you find that to be a natural thing? Is that a comfortable thing to be both techie and, empathetic and artistic? Because that seems like a different half of the brain.
I have found it to be natural for me. I always try to resist being like, oh, all designers should code, or, because that, I feel like that gets brought up, that's whatever the tab spaces debate is kind of thing. You hear that make the rounds, oh, should designers code? I don't ever want to be like, yes, that's natural. Everyone should do that. For me, it seemed to make a lot of sense because I was really interested in seeing problems all the way through. Right. So you kind of have an idea and you get to build this design, you're doing all this research and you get really invested. And then I had such a hard time handing that to somebody else to finish. And I was like, no, that's mine. I'm not ready to go yet. And I discovered that by learning how to code, I didn't have to let it go. I got to keep working on it and follow through and kind of complete that whole cycle. So yeah, for me, it felt right.
So you've been a dev, though, for 10 plus years, but you went design first and then said, well, I want to own my own code and my own design, and I'm going to be a front end developer. Some people become developers and then they go, wow, my code is fine, but my designs are ugly. So I started out as a dev and I started to think about design. Do you think you started out as a designer and started to think about code? And does it matter which direction one comes from?
I don't think it matters. I was one of those kids that did a little bit of coding growing up because I was the right age for that, right when MySpace was a thing and GeoCities was a thing. And to be on the internet at all required a certain level of HTML, CSS, right? And enough JavaScript to be dangerous sometimes. So it didn't feel like a big leap to me. It felt like the same stuff I'd been playing with and messing with forever. And I had dabbled. I took a Java class in high school. It was never something that I thought of as a career at the time. That was just fun. That was just on the computer playing around. Didn't everyone do that, right? For whatever reason, that hadn't connected to me as a thing. I don't know that I had anyone else that I knew of that was coding as a career. I didn't put those pieces together.
Yeah, you really nailed it, though. We grew up at a time that was so perfect that, hey, you want a MySpace? Let's view source and look at someone else's MySpace and see how they did it. I feel like the joy of that part of the internet, the view source aspect of the internet, is kind of gone. And that makes me sad because you view source now and you see a bunch of auto-generated JavaScript crap. The first time I view sourced on Gmail, and I'm like, there's nothing here for me to see. It's garbage.
Oh, it's terrifying. Yeah.
I wonder if we could ever get back there, though, because I feel like we have another generation now, and you're probably not part of this generation. You're seeing that generation come up, which is the Figma designers, where they were born in a world where Figma was the thing. Because I felt like we had Macromedia, Dreamweaver, and we had all the tools. There was 50 different ways to make a vector and then get it into SVG or get it into PNG or get it into JPEG. Is that a bad thing? Is there a design tools monoculture that we're in right now?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think when we're developers looking in, right, you only see the really big stuff, right? If you asked a designer to name development stuff, yeah, maybe they'd be able to name VS Code or something, because it's the stuff that gets big enough. But there is a lot of design software that's out there. There's lots of prototyping tools and lots of design tools that aren't Figma that are doing just fine. Figma certainly is doing amazing work, I think, in the realm of web design. And it was one of the first ones that really focused on user interface design specifically, and it set them apart. And they've continued to do that, I think, with dev mode and stuff. I'm just a big fan. They should be paying me to say this, right? But I'm so interested in what they're doing. But I don't know that it's a monoculture any more than we see over on the dev side, right? I mean, if you're working in React, then everything's leaning in the direction of Vercel and Next.js right now. but there's other stuff. People are using them.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Because there may be a monoculture, but it's more like we're just seeing a new shiny object and running towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the context of Figma, people have found something that like really works and people are starting to use it. I think I'm of the generation where I'm always changing from different file formats. So for me, it's like, okay, I started as a PNG. I'm going to trace this and turn it into an SVG. Like literally yesterday, I found a bitmap I wanted and I brought it into Inkscape, which is like an open source, tool, and then traced it because I don't know how to use Adobe Illustrator, and then turned that into an SVG and then manually edited the SVG. And I showed that to someone and they were like, you should have just recreated it in Figma. I'm like, I don't know how. So I'm trying to figure out like what's the right thing for me to learn the foundations of design when I'm a dev.
I always feel like the best tool is the one you know. That's a cop-out answer, right? I get that. There are benefits for sure to learning the tool that everyone is using. But I feel like especially when I talk to other developers who are interested in kind of stepping into design, dipping their toes in, getting a little bit more comfortable, a lot of them feel very intimidated by the thought of having to like learn a whole new tool. And I don't know that you have to. If that's something you want to do, if you're thinking about like making a full career transition, sure. But a lot of times I'm talking to people that just want to get enough design kind of under their belt to make something that doesn't look like crap. They just want to make a user interface that's not actively bad to use. And I think that's a pretty reasonable and good goal. In that case, I don't think you need to jump through the hoops of learning something new. I think leaning on the skill set that you already have and just stretching it a little bit further to kind of think about these design considerations. I mean, you can design with pen and paper. You can design with whatever process you already know. You can open up your code editor and start writing CSS and do your designing live in the browser rather than setting another hurdle. I like to encourage people to work with what they've got and to play from their strengths, I guess. It's hard enough to take on something new.
I will say, though, I respect that your bar for like, and this, I'm taking this as like a personal attack, but also a good thing. Your bar for me entering design is to actively not suck, because you're like, just lower the bar. Just make sure that it's not awful. And that is actually a reasonable place for me to be as a dev trying to make something pretty.
Well, I think that is actually where we're most successful, right? Because we kind of talked a little bit about the like, should designers code thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's nice. I think it's a nice perk. I don't think designers need to be able to code like a full stack developer. Mm-hmm. But I think when they know their way around CSS properties, when they understand the concept of semantic HTML, that stuff makes them much stronger designers, because then they can start to think about how their design is going to be adapted and they can kind of work 2 steps ahead. They understand better the limitations of the system, and they can think more about like, when this is responsive, I can visualize how this is going to stack because I know this is going to be like a Flexbox thing and I know how Flexbox works, right? I think the bar is and should be low. Doing one job is hard enough. We don't need everyone to do 3 jobs. My big thing is always, right, we hear a lot of should designers code. We don't hear very much should developers design. The street never seems to go fully 2 ways. So I like to encourage it, again, at that level that hopefully doesn't feel intimidating or like, I need you to read these 20 books and write me a full report and, learn 3 new programs and, right? Just learn enough to be able to communicate. Learn enough to get the gist of what they're talking about and what a designer is prioritizing. And when they're talking about a Figma variable, like, what does that mean? Just that's different than a JavaScript variable. Like, you really are just trying to do enough to bridge the gap. And if both parties do that, then you meet somewhere in the middle where you can start to make some really awesome
I love this, because finding that design language, and I'm using that as a double entendre there, which is like both the design language itself, but the language for the designer to talk to the developer is super important. And you actually have a book, a free PDF, and we'll put a link in the show notes that folks who are listening to the show can just go and sign up, and then they'll get this like almost 200-page book called Foundation of Designs for Developers. And I was impressed when you say foundations, like you're not joking. You're like, chapter 1, color. I'm like, really? I thought it was going to be chapter 1, rounded buttons. No, there's no rounded buttons for like a while. You're literally like common color mistakes. And that's really fundamental. But at the same time, though, you just said, what is the designer valuing? What is the designer's like thought process? This is what you're trying to teach us. And it's specifically a design book for devs. It's really good. You should be very proud of this.
Thank you. It's very kind. It was something that I was really excited to do because it was something, right? You mentioned briefly that I have a fine arts degree. That was what I went to school for. And when you start a fine arts degree, that's what your classes are like, and it's very much like, all right, yeah, you probably think you know how to draw. You've probably been drawing for a long time, especially, you come out of high school and you have to have a portfolio to get into these programs. And so you kind of come in thinking you've got some level of knowing what's going on. And they're like, okay, step it back. We're going to talk about perspective. We're going to talk about color. We're going to talk about value. We're going to really start you over. And when you do that, you realize kind of how fundamental that is. And a lot of that stuff is stuff that most of us pick up naturally, right? Just moving through the world, you kind of have this understanding of how color works because most of us can see a full spectrum of color. You have an understanding loosely of how typography works because we read constantly, but you don't necessarily know why. Being able to really articulate the why is crucial, I think, especially when we're talking about UI design and development, because that's what helps us catch things that don't look right. I feel like most of the time people come and they're like, I can't get this to look professional, or something's off and I can't name it. I can't put words to it. And we can't do that, unfortunately, when we've jumped ahead and we're already thinking in rounded button land, right? We got to scale it back and be thinking in color and balance and visual hierarchy land to catch most of that stuff. And once we get those foundations, then we can go that's why that rounded button looked so weird.
I love that. This is really helpful, actually. Let me ask you this. I have to engage with our design team a lot, and I feel like oftentimes people lead people who are not designers, so I'm pointing at myself here, lead with the solution. And we'll say something like, oh, well, this should be this color, or this should be rounded or whatever. I'm trying, and this is something I've done maybe for the last 10 years, to use feeling words that express that the design doesn't make me feel the way I want to feel, and I want to feel this way, on purpose, so that I don't try to tell them about color or rounded buttons so I'll say something like, this isn't energizing, or I want to feel this should be more relaxing and I want to be more subdued. And then I leave the solution up to them. Is that an appropriate way to interact with the designer? Because otherwise I'd be leading with, there's too much blue here. And that feels like it's a subjective opinion as opposed to the vibes are wrong. I don't want to step on their toes.
No, I think that does make sense. A lot of design, I think, and here's the part where I'm going to sound really annoying. I'm going to sound like an annoying art person. Design is about figuring out the problem. So before you can even get into the color and the type and all of that stuff, all the foundations are ways that we can create a solution. But before we can get into that, we need to make sure that the problem we're solving is the one that we want to. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of dance around it and we're going to keep putting colors on it and we're going to keep trying new things, and it's never going to work 100% right because we haven't figured out exactly the thing that we want to solve. So when you were telling me that, what I'm hearing, right, is this feeling of this isn't communicating the thing that I want it to communicate, right? This isn't solving the problem that I set out to solve with this design. A lot of times I like to try and scale it back and try to articulate the solve. What's the need? What's the goal? What's the problem? And from there, then we have this whole tool belt of things that we can reach for. That's the design part, right? What are the colors that we're using to communicate this particular emotion? But when we don't know the emotion that we're trying to capture, then we can't choose colors intentionally. So again, I get that feels a little pretentious. It's designers are problem solvers, but
I don't think it's pretentious, because if I'm talking about an algorithm and, we're using a bubble sort or this sort or that sort, we have to always remind ourselves and ground ourselves in the business problem. Why are we? What is the goal here? Well, the goal is for a fast and snappy, UI. So, okay, let's make decisions that lean towards the business goal, which is a great experience as they go through the shopping cart. And then, in the book here, you have a whole section on color and emotion. Is the design language for the company? Is the way we write our copy, our prose, the way the company presents itself? And these are getting farther and farther away from the developer writing a for loop. Are we an energizing, passionate, excited company, or are we a relaxing and trustworthy and subdued company? Those are going to inform colors, emotions, buttons, styles, depth, skeuomorphism, all of those things.
I will throw in there real quick. developers write more copy than we think we do. I know that was not the point of what you were saying, but I think about that all the time, right? Is that when we're writing error messages or button names or tooltips that come up when you hover, so often that ends up being a developer's problem. All those little pieces of micro copy. And we don't think about ourselves writing copy because we're not writing, marketing landing page, top of the funnel kind of stuff. But we write so much, and a lot of that makes it into the final product. And even just having one eye on we're trying to sound friendly, or we're trying to sound professional, or, we're trying to sound whatever, that might be the difference between a button saying, let's go, and a button saying, next. And we probably write that.
That is a great point. That is a great point. And a developer might be like, it doesn't matter, like next or whatever, or an arrow, but you'll see this in Windows, right? Like I work at Microsoft in my day job, and then somewhere in Windows in 2024 and Windows 11 in the latest version of the operating system, you see some weird janky error message that someone wrote in 1995. It may not be fluent English. It may be poorly phrased. It may be ambiguous. And it's probably some dude or dudette's error message that they just wrote on a random Tuesday.
Yep.
And no one ever looked at it. And that's copy. And then you're like, Windows, you suck. And you're picking on this one human, and the billion of us now have to deal with that. So those little things matter, and that's part of design, right?
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times, I think the error message is the great one, right? A lot of times when you see the stuff that a developer has had to write, it means that you as a user have fallen through the cracks somewhere. Something's gone wrong. And so not only are you now seeing the copy that the developer wrote, you're seeing it at a time when you probably need a little extra explaining or a little extra user friendliness to get you back on track. And those tend to be the kind of gaps where things get rough.
In the book, you go through a lot of examples. You have lots of screenshots of sites that work and sites that don't. I do feel a little bit right now, and this is as someone who's been on the internet, since its inception, I feel like we're heading towards a somewhat homogenous internet. We've all found our colors. We've all found our rounded buttons. Most websites have big hero image, big call to action button, 8 boxes, and then pictures of people who've got quotes. Is that a lack of creativity on the part of design, or is that just that we've literally got it so finely honed to what works that every website looks the same?
I think a lot of that is actually the fact that you don't necessarily need a designer on your staff anymore to make a website that doesn't look terrible. I think a lot of times when we're seeing those sites that look like every other site, what we're actually seeing is a Squarespace or, a template of some sort, right? Those to me feel like WordPress pages. And that's not bad. I want to be super clear that I'm not dunking on Squarespace or WordPress or whatever, because I think the coolest thing about the web is the ability for anyone to go on and put their content on there. I want to make a blog about whatever. I can do that. I don't have to be a designer. I don't have to be a developer. That rules. That's awesome, genuinely. But everyone's choosing from a template or from a list of things that's pre-created and looks good, and they just tweak the colors on it. That does tend to make everything look kind of the same. And then I think when we see lots of those, right, if we are a developer who doesn't necessarily feel super comfortable designing, we replicate a system that we know works, which again, not inherently bad. You're hitting a kind of middle ground here where things are feeling more usable. You're replicating something that works and you don't necessarily know why it works, but you end up with something that's not bad, right? And that feels easy to kind of fall into this trap. Yeah, it's a mixed bag, right? It could be worse. You could have a site that functions poorly and doesn't work and doesn't make any sense. With those 3 pictures, at least right? There's 3 things here. That's 3 places for me to highlight different aspects of this program I'm selling. And there's a big header and there's a big picture. And that tells me that's where my eyes are supposed to start when I scan the page. These things aren't creative. They are functional.
So that means that we're at a place now on the internet where we can get a Bootstrap template, and again, no disrespect to Bootstrap, no disrespect to WordPress, but the defaults are good enough. But that means that we have a bunch of sites that are 80% fine, which is kind of like the whole ChatGPT thing where it can auto-generate a B-
exactly
site. We've seen large companies and sites make AIs. They can say make me a nice shopping page, and it'll auto-gen one. And it's it's fine. But it's important, I think, to know that websites can be amazing, right? They could go way beyond. And it's like a bummer that we don't do that. And it seems like you're advocating that we should like try harder and go from 80% to 95% awesome.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, yes, absolutely. That's part of the process. You start at, whatever, 60%, and then you go, what small improvements can I make? And that gets you up to 70%. And well, what if I do this? I think that's also a thing that freaks people out, is this feeling that like, well, I'm not good enough to get to 90%. So I'm going to take this 60% template and I'm going to say, done, good enough, right? But we don't think about code that way. At least most of the other developers I've met don't, right? They write something to the best of their ability. And then when we know a little more, or the best of standards have changed, then we usually go back and refactor. And it's like, oh, I learned this new thing. I know how to speed this up now, or we've been having this issue and now I get to reopen this and I can rework it in a way that's going to be faster, better, more efficient, whatever. Design's the same way. It's iterative, right? What we design is not carved into stone. We get to go back and keep working on it a little bit at a time. So yeah, I think anything we can do to keep pushing the boundaries, because I think you're right. When you see a website that feels like it's not the same as everything else, it sticks out to you. You remember it.
Yeah. Well, actually, in the world of social media right now, people are talking about, like, can we get back to the weird web? Because it's like Facebook and LinkedIn, it's all the same, right? Mm-hmm. Like we've just circled the drain to the point where everything looks the same. Like in my taskbar right now, I have Mastodon, Threads, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all pinned as PWAs. And they're all the same because we've just got the same place. And I feel like I'd like to go back to the bizarrely goofy web that's just like GeoCities and like personal blogs that look even Medium. Like Medium ruined blogs for me because everything looks like a Medium blog now because it's so minimalist. But you talk about this concept in the book I want to dig into a little bit called Gestalt principles or Gestaltism. Yeah. I'm wondering if that's a psychology of how we perceive things. And I'm wondering if that's what's driving us towards this monoculture of design styles.
Sometimes I hesitate to say like, yes, that's the thing, right? Because every design thing is just a tool, right? That's like, oh, like we see the color blue in tech a lot. Is blue causing the decline of tech creativity? No, blue's just a color, right?
Okay, so, that's valid. That's a leap, you're right.
Right, but when we find a shorthand that's effective, it does make sense for people to lead into it. That's what those Gestalt principles are. It's like, oh, we figured out that when we group items in certain ways, we can build connections between them, or we can intentionally separate them. We figured out how our brain tries to parse the information that's available to us visually. And so we can kind of lean into things and be like, oh, when there are two items really close to each other, we're going to create a connection between them mentally. When they're placed far apart, we're going to separate them. So yes, when we find things like cards are a common component, that, you have a little box that's got whatever, probably a picture and a header and some text and maybe a button. Cards are everywhere, right? Pinterest, every Twitter feed or Facebook feed or anything is going to be just a list of cards now, because that works really well. It contains all the information in a way that makes sense. It creates a boundary. They stack well. They rearrange well for the responsive web. Sometimes things that work, right? To me, it's more about how are we using those, right? Because if we're creating something that's just a clone of something we've already seen. I remember when Pinterest first happened, everything was just that mosaic tile layout. It was rough. That was all we saw for months, I feel like. Now that's kind of faded out. These things move in trends as well, I guess, is maybe the point that I should have been making more articulately. Right?
No, I think you're right. I think they do move in trends, but at the same time, this Gestalt theory that you talk about in the book is identifying that these are things humans do. Like these are universal things. This isn't Western culture. Right. It's not, just Northern Hemisphere. It's people. Humans like proximity. And proximity means these things are near each other. They are related in some way, or at least you want me to think they're related. Right. And that's how you can basically manipulate the psychology of someone by putting these buttons together, or things are similar, or like you said, you close something up by putting it in a box. Even in books, you're reading a book and then there's like that little box in the corner that says, hey, here's a little aside. We accept that little aside as being peripheral but important. And that's just human psychology that we can use to get people to interact with our designs and our apps the way we want them to.
Web design is especially interesting, I think, because we're kind of working with what's known as a user's mental model, right? Which is the way that's all the experience they've gained from navigating the web in different ways. So like when you open a website and there's a logo in the, top left, You expect to see that there, and you expect that when you click on it, it takes you to the home page, right? Those are patterns that we've built up from years of experience doing this now. And we want to kind of thread this like needle of being interesting enough that we don't look like everyone else, but also not breaking patterns that people are expecting, because then our sites become challenging to use. And we start working against the mental model that people have created, and then they have to stop and think like, that didn't work the way that I thought it was going to work. Or now I have to remember that this site, when I right click, it does something different, or, the command S to save that I thought was going to work here, it does another thing on this page, and that drives me bonkers, so.
I was helping my 18-year-old fill out his very first taxes. We're filling out the form, and you know how you type your address, you hit tab, you type your city, you hit tab, and then usually, like I live in Oregon, and I know that you go to the drop down for the state of Oregon and you go, because you have to go past Ohio. And like in Oregon's like 3 O's, right? But for some reason on this site, the drop down didn't accept text input. It required you to click on. It was what they call an owner draw component. Mm-hmm. So they had drawn custom with some library that they'd gotten this ridiculous drop down. And so like we're going. It's not responding to input. Well, because we were using the keyboard. So then you got to scroll. And instead of just going, tab, it didn't work. And it's just like, wow, like it's 2024. We've solved these problems. Like sites like Stripe that like want your money. Right. You can just put a zip code and it'll put in the county and the city. It was such a mental speed bump. It was exactly what you're saying. Like this is supposed to work and why doesn't it work? It slowed us down significantly and it was so irritating. And there's someone out there who worked on that tax site who wrote that form. Was it a failure of design, failure of component selection, failure of testing? It was a cascade. I'm not blaming that individual, but I'm just saying there's a cascading failure that the model for filling out forms and entering in a dropdown failed that day. And it will never be the same.
No, but you remember it, right? Like it stood out to you and you were like, that was really annoying. And that's rarely the emotion that we want when people are on the websites that we make.
Yeah, you talk about delight in the book because that's what you want to do. Like if it's not delightful, whether it be the font or the colors or the components or the widgets or whatever you picked, the point is that they go, yeah, that was a fun experience, or at the very, very least, not a bad experience.
Yeah. I think there's also some room for realism here, right? That sometimes we're building things that are not going to be fun and delightful. Sometimes what we're going for is ease or speed. Like you were probably never going to have a delightful experience doing your taxes. I think about that every year when I do my taxes and they do silly little animations. And I'm like, I'm glad you're having a good time. I'm not having a good time right now. One of us should be having a good time, I guess.
I feel like that with the Duolingo, the freaking owl on Duolingo is just like doing its little dance or whatever. Like, it just, no,
right.
that wasn't, I didn't need an animation there.
Right. I just whiffed that whole lesson. I don't want to watch you dance right now. I feel bad.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. And everyone talks about the Duolingo guilt, like, the guilt notifications where it's like, haven't seen you in 3 days. I'm feeling lonely. I'm going to learn Korean. Yeah, my goodness. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I want to point out to our audience that the ebook, Foundations of Design for Developers, is free. It's like 200 pages of great advice. It's very practical knowledge for devs to kind of get involved in the design process. And you can check that out in the show notes. It's just you log in, give your email, and they'll send you the PDF. It's fantastic. I've got it on my iPad. And I want to thank you for working on it, Kathryn Grayson Nanz from Progress.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.